Ba-dum, ba-dum. No Time to Die has been delayed countless times, and the running joke is that it was just never going to be released. Well, it's now just about here. I got to see it early, so let's talk Bond. James Bond has left the active service, but his peace is short-lived when an old friend from the CIA turns up asking for help, leading Bond onto the trail of a mysterious villain armed with dangerous new technology. This is going to be spoiler-free because the movie doesn't come out until October 8th in the US, and I don't want to ruin anything for you. That also means, though, that I'm going to have to be vague in certain spots, just so you're aware. Alright, this is Daniel Craig's last portrayal as Bond, and I think the story does him justice. And I know that not all of his Bond movies have been spectacular, but in this, he does get to leave the role with flair. This film brings in quite a large list of actors, many that have been in previous Bond films, but there are some new additions too. Returning are Léa Seydoux, Ralph Fiennes, Ben Whishaw, Naomi Harris, Jeffrey Wright, Rory Kinnear, and Christoph Waltz. And new this time are Rami Malek, Lashana Lynch, Ana de Armas, Billy Magnussen, and David Dencik. Now, the plots of Bond films tend to follow pretty much the same structure when it comes to development. We start with some dramatic action that's meant to draw us into the story and reconnect us with Bond. Then the narrative slows down a bit to develop the impetus for the story, and then once it's been established what the mission is going to be, well, at least partially, the film then dives headlong into the action, and hopefully wowing us all the way along. For No Time to Die, I enjoyed how the story sets up the antagonist, but doesn't really let us in on just how much it all will unfold until much later on in the story. Now, you may have heard that the runtime for this is 2 hours and 43 minutes long, which does sound like a long one, and it kind of is in spots, but only mildly. The time we feel it is obviously in the quieter moments where there isn't action occurring, but in these times we do get more of the character and story development that then help us to connect even more with our characters. And I've got to say that I was surprised at the level of emotion I felt in this, especially towards the climax. I thought the story was compelling and touching, and it caused my feelings to swell, even though the outcome was pretty obvious. Now, the action in this is pretty crazy at times. Now, if you've seen the trailers, you know some of what to expect, and I didn't watch all of the trailers, but from what I did see in those, the film still holds on to a bunch of action sequences that weren't shown in those trailers, so there is something new for us to experience. Now, for me, I think my favorites are when there are car chases. And one in particular towards the beginning of the film is where it's just in tight spaces and all kinds of peril are surrounding our characters. And the camera work captures the action in just a really effective way that doesn't get all shaky on us so we can't see what's going on. Now, there are some moments where it's not totally steady, but on the whole, the shots are fluid and smooth, even though they're following an action that's occurring at breakneck speeds. And that sequence isn't the only one that gets insane. I mean, there are more than a handful of scenarios that are created to just up our adrenaline. There are gunfights, hand-to-hand battles, and several close quarter exchanges. There was this one sequence that made me chuckle, even though I don't think it was supposed to. Now, the way some of the action takes place, it really looked like it came out of a Fast and Furious movie. It's not that the action was stupidly unrealistic, it was just how the sequence came together, and it just felt a little bit silly. But that feeling quickly passed, and I was then sucked right back into the high-intensity chase. Now, as with any of the Bond films, there is a certain level of believability that just has to be suspended because the amount of damage that Bond sustains would just be enough to kill a normal person several times over. And just in the poor man's ears alone, good grief, it's amazing that he can hear anything at all with all of the explosions that he endures. But that's also what makes these films so much fun. There is a certain level of ridiculousness that is expected. And that goes all the way back to the original 007 films. I mean, a slight level of implausibility is okay. Something that I noticed which stood out to me as mildly amusing was there was one sequence where I kind of thought I was going to hear, "No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die." Now, with the villains in this, I'm not sure I totally buy their motivations and rationale. We get antagonists from both Christoph Waltz and Rami Malek. Now, for Malek, I understand one portion of his drive because it is explained and it does make sense. But then the other half of his diabolic agenda felt just a little bit underdeveloped. Now, from a dastardly deed perspective, it makes perfect sense for an angry villain. But for the story itself, I personally would have liked to have seen more in the way of his motivations. And with any of the bad guys' motivations, I think that's probably the weakest portion of the film overall. On a base level, we get why they do what they do, but some make decisions that I think do warrant a little bit more depth. But I also acknowledge that to do that would add a bunch more time to a story that's already heading towards the long side. Now, if you're a car person, there are several iterations of Aston Martins that are showcased. I loved it, but I was also bummed that there was one that I really wanted to see and it was only shown in the background and not utilized. Now, maybe if there are future 007 films, it will get to see the light of day. So here's the deal. If you're a fan of the Bond franchise, I think you're really going to enjoy this one. It's got all the trappings of a 007 movie, plus a lot of heart. The story allows Craig to shine and gives him one last spectacle of glory as just our super spy assassin. Now, if you're not a fan of the Bond films, this one is still a fun action ride of a movie. Yeah, there are some portions to the story that could use more depth, especially when it comes to the antagonist's final plan, but aside from that, there's engaging drama, crazy action, plus even some romance. Yeah, you are going to have to suspend some belief in circumstances, but that's also why we go to the movies. I think on the whole, this is a gratifying and entertaining time at the cinema. The big cast of characters all works in conjunction, using their charisma to craft dynamics that make for an engrossing watch. The pace does feel a bit slow in parts, but those are quickly resolved as more action ensues. So there's not really any sex, which is surprising for a Bond film. There's no nudity, some profanity, and a ton of violence. I give No Time to Die 4 out of 5 couches. So are you a 007 fan? Which of the movies is your favorite? Now, if that's too large of a choice, what's your favorite Bond film that stars Daniel Craig? Either way, I'd love to know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.